The Sri Lanka Army is the oldest and largest of the Sri Lanka armed forces and is the nation's army. Established as the Ceylon Army in 1949, it was renamed when Sri Lanka became a republic in 1972. In 2010, the army had approximately 200,000 regular personnel, between 20,000–40,000 reserve personnel and 18,000 National Guardsmen, and comprises 13 operational divisions, 1 Air Mobile Brigade, 1 Commando Brigade, 1 Special Forces Brigade, 1 Independent Armored Brigade, 3 Mechanized Infantry Brigades and over 40 infantry brigades. From the 1980s to 2009, the army was engaged in the Sri Lankan Civil War. The professional head of the Sri Lanka Army is the commander of the army, currently Lieutenant General Krishnendra de Silva. The commander-in-chief of the Sri Lankan military is the President of Sri Lanka, who heads the National Security Council through the Ministry of Defence, which is the highest level of military command charged with formulating, executing defence policy and procurements for the armed forces. However, operations of the Sri Lanka Army are coordinated by the Joint Operations Command, with other two armed forces. History. Ancient and pre-colonial times. The first military engagements in Sri Lankan history were marked by the advent of King Vijaya, a Bengal prince who landed along with his followers on the beaches of northwestern Sri Lanka around 543 BC. Prince Vijaya and his followers occupied the lands of the native Veda people. Repeated incursions by South Indians, particularly the Collays, into Sri Lankan territory occurred throughout the next few centuries and led to the engagement of the rival forces in battle. In one famous encounter, Sinhalese King Datugumunu raised an army of 11,000 inhabitants in his battle against the Chola invader King Elara, whom he eventually defeated. King Datugumunu's organizational skills, bravery and chivalry are famous, and his battles have gone down in history as outstanding offensive operations. Other Sri Lankan rulers whose military achievements stand out include King Gajabahu, who sailed to India to bring back his captured soldiers, and King Datisna, who is credited with repulsing numerous Indian invasions and for organizing a naval build-up to deter sea-borne attacks. He also had the foresight to cover his defences with artillery. Vijaya Bahu I was another warrior king who dislodged Indian invaders and united the country. Parakrama Bahu the Great was an outstanding monarch of the Polonnaruwa period of Sri Lankan history, and his accomplishments as a military leader and a great administrator are noteworthy. His reign included a military expedition to Burma in retaliation for indignities inflicted on his envoys and Burmese interference in the elephant trade. This marked the first overseas expedition in Sri Lankan military history. It is also reported that Parakrama Bahu's frame was such that his assistance was sought by South Indian rulers who were involved in internecine struggles. Another strong ruler in the pre-colonial era was Parakrama Bahu I, who defeated Indian invaders, united the island and ruled it from capital Sri Jayawardenapura, Kota. Although the known epigraphical records do not indicate that the Sri Lankan rulers had a full-time standing army at their disposal, there is evidence supported by legend, designation, name, place and tradition that prove there were standby equestrian, elephant, and infantry divisions to ensure royal authority at all times. Militias were raised as the necessity arose, and the soldiers returned to their pursuits, mainly for farming, after their spell of military duty. Colonial-era parts of Sri Lanka came under the control of three colonial European powers, namely the Portuguese in the 16th century, the Dutch in the 17th century and the British in the 18th century. Yet, until the entire island was ceded to the British in 1815, regional kingdoms maintained most of their independent defence forces and were able to successfully repulse repeated thrusts by the European armies. However, the British, unlike their counterparts, were not primarily restricted to maritime power, and thus had the capability to bring the entire island under their control and to integrate locals into the British Defence Forces. Portuguese and Dutch rule. In the beginning of the 16th century, modern Europe first came in contact with Sri Lanka, which was then referred to as Ceylon. In 1505, a Portuguese fleet, while operating in the Indian Seas against Arab traders, was blown off course and landed at Galle, on the southern coast of the island. In 1517 the Portuguese reappeared, and with the consent of the Sinhalese king established a trading post in Colombo. Having initiated contact with Sri Lanka as traders, the Portuguese soon made themselves political masters of the western seaboard. Numerous forts were soon established, and features of European civilization were introduced. The Portuguese are credited with the introduction of European-style fortresses to Sri Lanka during this era, although some locals already possessed military training and fighting experience. There is no evidence that the Portuguese employed local inhabitants into their own forces. Thus, the Portuguese were forced to restrict their presence in the island due to their small numbers, and their efforts were more focused toward projecting maritime power. In 1602, Dutch explorers first landed in Sri Lanka, which was then under Portuguese control. By 1658, they had completely ousted the Portuguese from the coastal regions of the island. Much like the Portuguese, they did not employ locals in their military, and preferred to live in isolation, pursuing their interests in trade and commerce. Like the Portuguese, they defended their forts with their own forces, but unlike the Portuguese, Dutch forces employed Swiss and Malay mercenaries. The Dutch forts in Jaffna, Galle, Matara, Batticaloa and Trincomalee were sturdily built and are considered a tribute to their military engineering skills. Also, like the Portuguese, the Dutch focused on maritime power, and although they had the capability to develop and use local forces, they chose to isolate themselves from the local population. British rule. The British Empire then ousted the Dutch from the coastal areas of the country, and sought to conquer the independent Kandyan kingdom. In the face of repeated British assaults, the Kandyans were forced into a degree of guerrilla warfare and fared well against their superior British adversaries. Initially, the British stationed their forces, which included naval vessels, artillery troops and infantry, to defend the island nation from other foreign powers, using the natural harbour of Trincomalee as their headquarters in Sri Lanka. In 1796, the Swiss and Malay mercenaries who were previously in the service of the Dutch were transferred to the British East India Company, while the Swiss de Meuron's regiment was eventually disbanded in Canada in 1822. The Malays, who initially formed a Malay Corps, were converted into the 1st Ceylon Regiment in 1802 and placed under a British commanding officer. In the same year, the British became the first foreign power to raise a Sinhalese unit, which was named the 2nd Ceylon Regiment, also known as the Sepoy Corps. In 1803, the 3rd Ceylon Regiment was created with Moluccans and recruits from Penang. All these regiments fought alongside British troops in the Kandyan Wars, which began in 1803. Throughout the following years, more Sinhalese and Malays were recruited to these regiments, and in 1814 the 4th Regiment was raised, which was composed entirely of African troops. It was later renamed as the Ceylon Rifle Regiment. Eventually, the Kandyan Kingdom was ceded to the British in 1815, and with that they gained control over the whole island. Resistance to British occupation cropped up almost instantly. During the first half-century of occupation, the British faced a number of uprisings, and were forced to maintain a sizable army in order to guarantee their control over the island. After the Matel Rebellion led by Purana Ppu in 1848, in which a number of Sinhalese recruits defected to the side of the rebels, the recruitment of Sinhalese to the British forces was temporarily halted. Ceylon Light Infantry Volunteers. The second phase in the employment of non-British personnel commenced in 1881 after the enactment of an ordinance Designed to authorize the creation of a volunteer corps in the island, it was designated the Ceylon Light Infantry Volunteers. This move compensated for the disbandment of the Ceylon Rifle Regiment in 1874. The Ceylon Light Infantry Volunteers was originally administered as a single unit. However, over the years various sections of the volunteers grew large enough to become independent from their parent unit. The different units that emerged from the volunteer force were the Cadet Battalion, Ceylon Light Infantry, Ceylon Artillery Volunteers, Ceylon Engineers, Ceylon Mounted Infantry, Ceylon Planters Rifle Corps, Ceylon Supply and Transport Corps, Ceylon Volunteer Medical Corps, Ceylon Defense Force. In 1910 the name of the military was formally changed to the Ceylon Defense Force. It continued to grow throughout the early period of the 20th century. The CDF saw active service when a contingent of the Ceylon Mounted Infantry in 1900, and a contingent of the Ceylon Planters Rifle Corps in 1902, took part in the Second Boer War in South Africa. Their services were recognized by the presentation in 1902 of a color to the CMI, and a presentation in 1904 of a banner to the CPRC. In 1922, the CDF was honored by the presentation of the King's and regimental colors to the Ceylon Light Infantry. During the First World War, many volunteers from the Defence Force travelled to Great Britain and joined the British Army, and many of them were killed in action. One of them, mentioned by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, was Private Jacquetine of the CLI, who was the last man left alive in his unit at the Battle of Lys, and who continued to fight for 20 minutes before he was killed. In 1939, the CDF was mobilized and an enormous expansion took place which required the raising of new units such as the Ceylon Signals Corps, the Auxiliary Territorial Service, and also the Colombo Town Guard, which had been previously disbanded, but was later reformed to meet military requirements. During the Second World War, Britain assumed direct control over the armed forces of Ceylon. Post-independence at the end of World War II, CDF, which had increased in size during the war, began demobilization. In 1948, Sri Lanka gained independence from Britain, becoming a dominion within the Commonwealth, and a year earlier Ceylon entered into the bilateral Anglo-Ceylonese Defence Agreement of 1947. This followed by the Army Act No. 17 of 1949, which was passed by Parliament on April 11, 1949 and formalised in Gazette Extraordinary No. 10,028 of October 10, 1949, marked the creation of the Ceylon Army, consisting of a regular and a volunteer force, the latter being the successor of the disbanded CDF. Therefore, October 10, 1949 is considered the Ceylon Army was raised, and October 10 is celebrated annually as Army Day. The Defence Agreement of 1947 provided the assurance that British would come to the aid of Ceylon in the event it was attacked by a foreign power, and provided British military advisors to build up the country's military. Brigadier James Sinclair, Earl of Caithness, was appointed as General Officer commanding Ceylon Army, as such becoming the first commander of the Ceylon Army. For much of the 1950s the Army was preoccupied with the task of building itself and training existing and new personnel. To this aim, the British Army Training Team Advisory Group carried out training for ex-members of the CDF within the Ceylon Army. Senior officers were sent to the British Army Staff College, Camberley, and some attached to units of the British Army of the Rhine to gain field experience. New officers were sent for training at Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, which continued until the 1960s, and both officers and other ranks were sent to specialist training courses in Britain, India, Pakistan and Malaya. There were no formations and all units were structured to directly function under the Army headquarters. However, temporary field headquarters were to be formed at the time requirement arose. Due to a lack of any major external threats, the growth of the army was slow, and the primary duties of the army quickly moved towards internal security by the mid-1950s. The same time as the 1st Ceylonese commander Major General Anton Mutukamaru took command of the army. The first internal security operation of the Ceylon Army began in 1952. Codenamed Operation Monty, to counter the influx of illegal South Indian immigrants brought in by smugglers on the northwestern coast, in support of Royal Ceylon Navy coastal patrols and police operations. This was expanded and renamed as Task Force Anti-Illicit Immigration in 1963 and continued up to 1981, when it was disbanded. The army was mobilized to help the police to restore peace under provincial emergency regulations during the 1953 Hartal, the 1956 Galoya Valley riots, and in 1958 it was deployed for the first time under emergency regulations throughout the island during the 1958 riots. During the 1950s and 1960s, the army was called Apron to carry to essential services when the workers went on strike, which were organized by the left-wing parties and trade unions for various reasons. The most notable was the 1961 Colombo port strike, during which ships threatened to bypass Colombo port and the country almost staved. To counter these common strikes, several units were formed, who were employed in development work when there were no strikes. In 1962, several volunteer officers attempted a military coup, which was stopped hours before it was launched. This attempted coup affected the military to a great extent, since the government mistrusted the military. It reduced the size and growth of the army, especially the volunteer force, with several units being disbanded. In May 1972, when Ceylon was proclaimed a republic and changed its name from the Dominion of Ceylon to the Republic of Sri Lanka, all army units were renamed accordingly. 1970 present. After successfully defeating the insurgency led by the Janath of V. Muthi Peramuna in 1971, the army was confronted with a new conflict, this time with the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam and other Tamil militant groups. The war escalated to the point where India was asked to intervene as a peacekeeping force. This was later seen as a tactical error, as the Indian peacekeeping force united nationalist elements such as the JVP to politically support the LTTE in their call to evict the IPKF. The war with the LTTE was halted following the signing of a ceasefire agreement in 2002 with the help of international mediation. However, renewed violence broke out in December 2005 and following the collapse of peace talks. The army has been involved in the heavy fighting that has resumed in the north and east of the country. Since 1980, the army has undertaken many operations against the LTTE rebels. The major operations conducted by the army eventually led to the recapture of Jaffna and other rebel strongholds. In the 19th of May 2009, Sri Lankan Army declared the victory of war as they found the dead body of LTTE leader Velupillai Prabhakaran. The Sri Lankan armed forces, including the army, have been accused of committing war crimes during the war, particularly during the final stages. A panel of experts appointed by UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon to advise him on the issue of accountability with regard to any alleged violations of international human rights and humanitarian law during the final stages of the civil war found credible allegations, which, if proven, indicated that war crimes and crimes against humanity were committed by the Sri Lankan armed forces and the Tamil Tigers. Major combat operations. Peacekeeping. The Sri Lanka Army has taken part in 2 peacekeeping missions with the United Nations over the course of its history. First assignment was in the Congo. Most recently, following the signing of a ceasefire agreement was signed between the government and the LTTE in 2002. Sri Lankan forces were invited by the United Nations to be part of the UN peacekeeping force in Haiti. In the process of the peacekeeping operations, 2 soldiers were killed in a raid in Petit Gove. After over 6 months of service, the first contingent of the peacekeeping force returned to Sri Lanka on May 17, 2005. In December 2007, 7th rotation of the Sri Lankan contingent had been deployed with a force of 991 officers and other ranks. Many of those deployed have been awarded the United Nations Medal for their services. Peacekeeping sex scandal. In November 2007, 114 members of the 950-member Sri Lankan Army peacekeeping mission in Haiti were accused of sexual misconduct and abuse. 108 members, including 3 officers of the 950-member-strong Sri Lanka peacekeeping contingent, is being sent back after being implicated in alleged misconduct and sexual abuse. UN spokeswoman Michelle Montes said, "The United Nations and the Sri Lankan government deeply regret any sexual exploitation and abuse that has occurred." Sri Lankan officials claimed that there was little tangible evidence on this case. After an inquiry, the UN Office of Internal Oversight Services concluded acts of sexual exploitation and abuse were frequent and occurred usually at night and at virtually every location where the contingent personnel were deployed. The OIOS is assisting in the pending legal proceedings initiated by the Sri Lankan government and has said charges should include rape because it involves children under 18 years of age. Current deployments. As of present, the bulk of the Sri Lankan Army is deployed for domestic defensive and combat operations, while a sizable foreign deployment is maintained. Domestic. Due to the Sri Lankan civil war, the Army has been on a constant mobilized state since the 1980s. The majority of the Army has been deployed in the north and eastern provinces of the country, which includes 14 divisions coming under 6 operational headquarters and 2 independent divisions and several independent brigades. The Army is also based in other parts of the island for internal security, including a division for the defense of the capital. Foreign. The Sri Lanka Army currently participates in several major overseas deployments. Haiti, an infantry battalion with support personnel totaling around 1,000 personnel in Haiti as part of the United Nations Stabilization Mission in Haiti since 2004. Chad, a contingent of engineers joined the United Nations mission in the Central African Republic and Chad on May 25, 2010. Lebanon, a mechanized infantry company with combat support personnel in the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon since November 2010. South Sudan. Sri Lanka Army's entry into South Sudan in 2014 as the newest member in the UN peacekeeping family marks a milestone in the Army history. Sri Lanka became the first country to deploy a surge contingent in South Sudan. Army maintain SRIMED Level 2 hospital, manned entirely by Sri Lanka Army Medical Corps personnel. Third-party source needed.